Ask him to read a chart, the tall one said, loud enough for the whole gallery to hear, and watch the toy soldier blink. I was 4 feet from Havard when the explorer said it, and I will tell you what I felt, standing there in my own red wool with my own rifle on my shoulder and no leave to turn my head. I felt the old want to step in front of my friend. It is a thing they never train out of you, no matter how many winters you stand a post. The want to put your body between a man you respect and the thing being thrown at him. I held it. We are paid to hold it. But I remember thinking, with a kind of slow, cold anger, that the man in the good coat had no idea at all who he had chosen to be clever about. My name is Renick Aldous, and I had stood beside Havard Crane on the cold marble of the Maritime Hall for 2 seasons by then, and I am the one telling this because Havard never would. He would tell you it was nothing. He told me after that it was nothing. But I was there, and I watched a room full of men who had crossed every ocean on a map find out that the stillest man in the building had been further into the dark water than all of them put together, and I have wanted for a long time to set it down properly. It was the opening week of the grand exhibition of the sea, and our house had lent 2 of its guard to stand the doors of the great Maritime Hall, a long stone gallery under a glass roof, hung with the things men bring back from the edges of the world. Brass diving helmets in a row like the heads of old gods, a whaler's longboat slung from the rafters, charts under glass, the real ones, the hand-inked ones, with the soundings written down the margins in dead men's careful hands, 100 lanterns, a sea-green carpet, and the smell of salt and old rope they had carried in from somewhere to make the visitors feel the deep was close. Havard and I stood at the foot of the Founder's chart, the great map of the hollow reach that the exhibition was built around. We were ceremony. We were the red and the brass that told the public a king had set his hand on this. We were not supposed to be looked at twice, and for 3 days we were not. Then the marine men came. They were the stars of the thing, you understand, the explorers, the men of science, the survey captains whose names were printed on the programs in larger type than the king's. There was a society of them, the Fellowship of the Sounding, and on the 4th morning they came through the hall in a tide of good coats and louder voices, and at the heart of them was the tall one, Dr. Sefton Marr. He had a beard cut close and a way of standing with his weight back on his heels, and he had charted. He would tell you within a minute of meeting you the whole of the Cape of Iron in a single season, and the room treated him like weather, like a thing that happened to you whether you wanted it or not. He stopped in front of the Founder's chart. He looked at it the way you look at a thing you intend to improve, and then his eye fell on the 2 of us, the 2 red statues at the foot of his map, and I saw the idea arrive in his face, the way you see a stone start to roll. "Look at these 2, he said to the men around him, the very picture of the realm's seafaring spirit. A few of them laughed, the easy laugh of men who laugh when the loud one does. Have you ever in your lives, Marr went on, seen 2 men who knew less about the sea? Havard did not move. I did not move. That is the trade. It's a fair question, said another of them, a younger one, eager, with a sounding line coiled at his belt. He had no use for indoors. I'll wager neither of them has been out of sight of land. Out of sight of a tea shop, said Marr, and that got the real laugh, and I felt the heat come up the back of my neck and I held it down where it could do no harm. I want to be fair to the man, even now. Sefton Marr was not a cruel man in the way some are cruel. He did not want to hurt us particularly. He wanted to be the cleverest man in a room full of clever men, and the cheapest way to be the cleverest man in a room is to find someone in it who cannot answer back and make him the joke. A sentry is the perfect target. We are forbidden the one thing that would end it. He knew that. They all knew that. It is why they did it in front of the charts and the helmets and the slung longboat, where the contrast was sharpest. The men who had been everywhere, and the 2 painted men who, they were certain, had been nowhere. You there, Marr said, and he was looking at Havard now, only at Havard, the way a man's eye will find the stillest thing in a room and decide to make it move. Yes, you, the statue. I'll give you a shilling for the room's amusement. Name me one sea, any sea. The one your grandmother soaked her feet in. Go on." Havard's eyes stayed forward. A muscle in his jaw did not move. I knew him well enough by then to read the half-inch of stillness that was him deciding not to answer, and I knew that the deciding cost him nothing. And I knew, though Mar could not have known it, that of every man under that glass roof, the one being told to name a sea had been to the bottom of one no other man present would go near. But that was hours off yet. In the moment there was only the laughter and the tall man's heels rocking back, and the younger one with the sounding line saying, "He can't even name one. Put it on the chart of the realm, the king's guard, ladies and gentlemen, brave defenders of the land who would drown in a bathtub." And the worst of it, the part I have never forgotten, was a small thing. A girl of perhaps 19, a visitor, who had been looking at us with the plain admiration the public so often brings, she stopped admiring. I watched it go out of her face. The clever men had told her what to see, and she saw it. She looked at Havard the way you look at a man who has been shown to be empty, and she moved on, faintly embarrassed to have thought him anything. And that, not the laugh, not the shilling, not the bathtub, that was the cost of the thing, and Havard wore it without a flicker, and I did not know yet how much it cost him to wear it. They did not let it go at one morning either. That is the part people forget about mockery, that the men who do it come back to it, the way a tongue comes back to a sore tooth. The fellowship had 3 days in the hall before the night the water came, and on each of them Sefton Marr found his way back to the foot of the chart, because a joke that lands once is a thing a certain kind of man cannot leave alone. On the second day, he brought a brass sounding weight from one of the displays and set it on the carpet at Havard's boots and said, "There. The deepest you'll ever sound, soldier the floor." On the third, he had the younger one with the coiled line measure the height of Havard's bearskin against the chart and announce to the visitors that the king's guard reached a full 2 feet closer to the sky than any of them will ever reach toward the deep. Each time the room laughed, a little less surely now, because there is a quality of stillness that begins, after the third day, to unsettle the men trying to break it. They wanted a flinch. They had been certain a flinch would come, and the not coming of it, hour after hour, was beginning to feel to them less like dullness and more like something they could not name and did not like. I felt it before I understood it. I stood beside him, and I felt the room's certainty start to bend. The visitors who came fresh, who had not heard the first morning's joke, did not see 2 painted men. They saw 2 soldiers, and a knot of loud gentlemen working very hard to make a sport of them, and more than one plain working visitor frowned at the gentlemen and not at us. A dockman's wife, in to see the helmets with her children, said to Mar's back loud enough, "Leave the poor man be, he's only doing his post." And Mar did not even turn, but I saw the younger one color. Mockery is a fire that needs feeding, and the hall was beginning in small ways to withhold the fuel. But Mar did not notice, or did not care. He had a thing he was right about, and being right about it in front of a crowd was the warmest he had felt in years, and he meant to keep warm. We were relieved at noon. In the guardroom set aside for us behind the hall, with the door shut and the wool unbuttoned at last, I said what I had been holding for 3 hours. "You should let me write him up. Conduct toward the guard. The master would have his name off the program by tea." Havard sat with his forearms on his knees and looked at the floor. He was a big man, slow-spoken, with hands that had done hard work before they did this work. I had noticed that the first week, the calluses that drill does not give you, the old white seam of a scar across the back of his right hand that he never explained. He was older than me by 10 years and steadier than me by 20. "For what?" he said. He told the truth as he sees it. He sees 2 painted men at the foot of his map. I'd see the same in his coat. "He called you." "He called the uniform a thing. He's allowed. The uniform's broad enough to take it." He worked his shoulder, the old man's roll of a joint that has been cold too long. "Let it go, Renick. A man who needs a room to laugh at someone is a man who's frightened of the room. Cleverest in the room is a lonely post to stand. Leave him to it. I let it go because he asked me to, and because there is a kind of authority a quiet man has that a loud one never will, and Havard had it. But I will tell you that I did not understand him. I thought he was being meek. I thought, God forgive me, that perhaps the marine men were a little right, that perhaps there was less behind the stillness than I had credited. I was young, and I had not yet learned the thing that the next day taught me, that the deepest water is the water that does not show on the surface, and the same is true of men. I tried once more that noon because it galled me. It's not the uniform he's insulting, I said. It's you. He's pointing at you by name in front of the whole room, calling you a fool about the one thing he's chosen to be expert in. Doesn't that reach you at all? Havard turned the question over slowly, the way he turned everything over. He pulled off one boot and looked at it. When I was a younger man than you, he said, I'd have wanted to make him eat it. There was a season I'd have wanted that more than I wanted my supper. He set the boot down. And then I went to a place where wanting things like that gets men killed, your own men, the ones depending on you keeping your head, and I unlearned it. You can't carry a temper into deep cold. The cold finds it and uses it against you. So you learn to set it down at the door, and after enough years of setting it down at the door, you find you've stopped picking it up at all. He looked at me then, a long, level look. A man like Mar is loud because something in him is frightened of being small. The kindest thing and the hardest thing you can do to a frightened man is refuse to give him the fight he's fishing for. Then he's left alone with the smallness, and that's the only thing that ever teaches him. Me shouting back would only make him feel large, so I stand still. He almost smiled. Besides, it's good practice, standing still under a thing you'd rather not stand under. That's the whole trade, Renick. Hours and he stopped, and did not finish. And I did not know then what the other trade was, and I did not ask, and I have been sorry ever since that I let the sentence die there, because I think for one moment he had been about to tell me. The next day broke the whole thing open, and it broke open because of weather, which is the only honest judge the sea has ever known. There had been a storm building 3 days out to the east. The exhibition had a grand event planned for that evening, a thing called the lantern sounding, where a great glass tank in the center of the hall, 12 feet deep and lit from within, was to have a diver go down in one of the brass helmets and bring up a casket of treasures from the deep for the crowd, a piece of theater, a trained man in good water doing a safe and pretty thing. But the storm came early and came hard, and by afternoon it had done a thing no one had planned for. The exhibition stood on the old harbor mole, half over the water, and beneath the maritime hall ran the founder's cellars, vaulted brick chambers, 2 centuries old, where the first survey company had kept its stores. Some genius of the exhibition had filled the deepest of those cellars with seawater and turned it into a grotto, a darkened walk-through with the real cold dark of the sea lapping at a rail, very atmospheric, very popular. And when the storm drove the tide up past every mark in living memory, the grotto did what flooded cellars do. The water came up the stairs. And before the alarm was fully understood, the lowest gate had jammed, and on the wrong side of it, in the rising black water of the founder's cellars, were 2 of the exhibition's people who had gone down to save the charts stored there. And a third, a boy, an apprentice of the survey, who had gone after them. I learned the shape of it the way everyone did, in pieces, in shouting. The hall, so grand an hour before, became a yard of panicked good coats. The fellowship of the sounding, every man of them a master of the sea on paper, stood at the top of the cellar stairs and looked down into the dark rising water, and not one of them moved. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy and cheap to call them cowards, and they were not exactly cowards. They were men who knew too much. They knew, to the foot, how cold that water was. They knew what it does to a man's chest in the first 10 seconds. They knew the cellars were a maze, and that the way down was a way you might not find a way back up from in the dark, in the cold, with the tide still rising. Their knowledge, which had made them great, had also drawn for each of them a very clear and very accurate map of exactly how a man dies in there. Mar stood at the rail with his close-cut beard and his charted cape of iron, and he was gray, and he did not move, and I do not entirely blame him. The men who really know the sea are often the last to fight it, because they have no illusions left. Havard was at the doors with me when it started. I saw him hear it, not panic, the particular quality of it, the way you hear that a thing is real. And I saw him do something I had never seen him do in 2 seasons. He left his post. He set his rifle against the founder's chart, careful, the way you set down a thing that is not yours to break, and he was already pulling at the buttons of his tunic as he crossed the hall, and I called after him, because it is in me to call after a man leaving a post, and he said over his shoulder in the same slow voice he used for everything, "Cover the doors, Renick. I'll be back to stand my watch." Then the keeper of the diving exhibit, an old salt named Cobb who ran the helmets, caught Havard's arm at the head of the stairs. "Soldier, you can't, nobody's going down there, it's a grave, the fellowship won't." And Havard looked at the brass helmet on its stand, the centerpiece of the whole lantern sounding, the pretty toy they had meant to play with that evening, and he said, "Is the air good in that?" Cobb stared at him. The pump's rigged for the tank. The lines are long enough to reach the cellar head, but you'd have to know how to." "I know how," Havard said. "Pump it steady. If the line fouls, I'll pull twice. Don't haul me unless I pull 3. And he was lifting the helmet, the great brass dome that the Marine men had been going to use for a piece of theater, and he was settling it on his own shoulders like a man putting on a hat he had worn 1,000 times, and the whole gray-faced fellowship of the sounding stood at the rail and watched a king's guard, the toy soldier, the man who couldn't name a sea, do up the seals of a diving helmet with the sure, fast hands of a man who had done it in worse places than this. I had not known. I swear to you I had not known. I had stood beside him for 2 seasons, and I had not known the first true thing about him. He went down the cellar stairs into the black water with the lamp at his breast throwing a single yellow cone, and the air line and the lifeline paying out behind him, and old Cobb working the pump like his own life hung on it, and the Marine men silent now, every clever word gone out of them, watching the red and the brass go down where not one of them would follow. And I stood at the head of the stairs with my heart going like the pump, and I thought of the white scar on the back of his hand, and the calluses, and the way he had said, "Is the air good?" in that the way another man asks, "Is the kettle on?" And I understood, far too late, that I had never once looked at my friend. What I knew of the next 20 minutes, I learned partly from Cobb working the pump and partly from Havard afterward. In the slow, flat way he told a thing, leaving out by habit every part where he might have looked brave. The founder's cellars were 3 chambers deep, and the water had filled the first to the vault and was climbing the second. The 2 exhibition men had got themselves onto a high stone shelf in the second chamber, above the water for now, but the tide was still coming and the air in the sealed vault was going bad, and they could not find the boy. The apprentice, the one who had gone in after them, had not made the shelf. He was somewhere in the flooded first chamber, in the dark, under the water that had already closed over the only door. "Mar, and I will give the man this. It is the one thing I will give him." Mar came halfway down the stairs to the water's edge as Havard went under, and shouted after him the only useful thing any of the fellowship said that night. "The first chamber vaults to the left. There's a stair recess on the left. A man might wedge in it above the floor." He had studied the founder's plans for his survey work. His great knowledge, which had kept him at the rail, gave Havard the one piece of the map he needed. I have thought about that since. The clever man could not go down, but he could throw the one who did the left-hand vault in the stair recess, and he did, and it mattered. Havard went down into the first chamber, into the black, with the cold closing on his chest exactly the way the Marine men knew it would, and he did not fight it because, he told me this part, the only part, because he thought it was a thing I ought to know for my own sake. You don't fight the cold, Renick. You make a friend of it. You breathe slow and you let it have your hands and you keep your head because the cold isn't trying to kill you, it just doesn't care, and a thing that doesn't care can be outlasted. He went left, the way the charted man had thrown him, and he found the stair recess and he found the boy. The apprentice was wedged in the recess above the floor, in an inch of air against the vault, half out of his mind with cold and dark, and he had done the one right thing a frightened man can do, which is to get his face into the last of the air and stop moving and wait, and he had waited, and a yellow light had come for him out of the black, a thing he said afterward he had taken for an angel and was very nearly right. Havard could not bring him out the way he had come. The boy could not swim and could not be trusted not to fight, and a fighting man in black water drowns the man who saves him as often as not. So he did the thing that I think no other man in that building could have done, the thing his trade and his other trade had each taught him in their own way. He was still. He got the boy's arms over his own shoulders and pinned them, and he put his helmeted head close, and through the brass and the water he made the boy feel the slow, enormous, unhurried calm of a man who was not afraid, and he held him there in the dark, against the cold, breathing the good air down the line, and he waited. He waited for Cobb to feel two pulls and understand and start to gather the lifeline slow, the way Havard had told him, and he kept the boy still by being still, all the way back through the flooded chamber, all the way to the stairs, all the way up into the lantern light, and he laid the apprentice down on the sea-green carpet of the maritime hall among the brass helmets and the slung longboat, alive. Then he went back down for the other two. He went back down twice more, because there were two men still on the shelf, and a helmeted man can carry only one through that black at a time. The second chamber was worse than the first. The air on the shelf had gone foul, and the two men had been breathing it too long, and a man stupid with bad air is nearly as dangerous to a rescuer as a man wild with fear. The first of them, the older, had kept his head, and came when Havard's hand closed on his collar, and let himself be moved slow and steady through the dark the way you must. The second did not. The second was younger and had been afraid longer, and when the yellow light came for him, he grabbed for it the way a drowning man grabs, and got his arms around Havard's helmet and would not let go. And for a moment, Cobb felt it on the line, 3 sharp tugs that were not the signal, the thrash of 2 men instead of the glide of 1. For a moment it could have gone the other way, and old Cobb stood at the pump with the color gone out of his face and did not haul. Because the signal had been 3 pulls steady, not 3 pulls wild, and Cobb was sailor enough to know the difference and to trust the man below to sort it. And Havard sorted it. He did not fight the frightened man. You cannot win that fight. 2 arms locked on your helmet in black water, and trying only drowns you both. He did the other thing, the harder thing. He stopped. He went utterly still in the man's grip, dead weight, no struggle, and a frightened man with nothing to fight against has nothing to feed on. And after a few seconds, long seconds, the longest of that night, Cobb said, the line gone slack and dreadful. The man's panic had no fuel and ebbed, and his grip loosened, and Havard got the locked arms down and pinned and brought him up the same slow way as the rest. I have thought since that he saved that last man with exactly the thing the fellowship had spent 3 days mocking. He stood still under a thing he'd rather not stand under, in the one place on earth where standing still was the whole of the skill, and it brought a man home. When the third of them was laid coughing on the carpet, the tide was a foot from the cellar vault, and the thing was finished, and the marine men stood in a silent half-circle, the whole brilliant fellowship of the sounding, and watched a king's guard lift the brass helmet off his streaming head and set it down as carefully as he had taken it up. His face when it came out of the helmet was the same face he wore on the post. That is the thing I keep coming back to. Whatever was behind it, and there was an ocean behind it, I knew that now it did not show. He looked for me, found me, and gave me the smallest nod, which I understood to mean cover the doors. I'm coming back to stand my watch. And the girl of 19, the one who had stopped admiring him, was in the crowd at the rail, and she was crying, and she was not the only one. It was Cobb, the old salt who ran the helmets, who put the first piece of it into words, because Cobb knew the sea trades the way Mar knew the charts, and Cobb had watched Havard's hands. "That's no soldier's first dive," Cobb said, to no one, to everyone, watching Havard wring the water from his sleeves. "Look how he came up. Look how slow he came up the last fathom. A man only comes up that slow if he's come up too fast once and lived to learn it. Where the King's Guard learn the bends." And one of the fellowship, not Mar, an older one, a survey captain with a white head and a quieter manner who had been standing at the back through the whole of the mockery, and had not laughed. This older one walked across the wet carpet and stood in front of Havard and looked at him for a long moment, and then he said a word. He said, "Vandermeer." Havard went still in a different way than I had ever seen him go still, not the trade stillness. A man stopping at the sound of his own name in a place he never meant to hear it. "It's Crane now," Havard said quietly. "Has been a long time." The white-headed captain turned around to the whole silent hall, to the fellowship of the sounding, and the soaked apprentice, and the crying girl, and the gray face of Dr. Sefton Marr. And he said, in the voice of a man laying a thing on a table where everyone can see it, "Gentlemen, you have spent 2 days asking this man to name a sea. Allow me to name one for him." He pointed at the great founder's chart of the Hollow Reach, the centerpiece of the whole exhibition, the map the building was built around. "You all came to see this chart. Half your reputations rest on the soundings written down its margins, the depths of the Hollow Reach, the only true survey of the deepest water on the coast, the water every one of you calls unsoundable and quotes in your papers as the edge of what is known." He let it sit. "It is signed in the corner, very small, the way that man signs things. The survey of the Hollow Reach was made 19 years ago by a single hand in a single open boat, sounding line by line, in water that had killed every survey sent before it. The man who made it went down himself, in a helmet like that one, where the line could not reach the bottom, to set the marks no instrument could set. He charted the dark water that the rest of us only dare to write about. And then he walked away from all of it and was never found, and the fellowship has argued for 19 years about whether he was even real." He looked at Havard. "You are looking at him. The chart you built your exhibition around, he made with his own hands at the bottom of the sea. He has stood at the foot of his own map for 3 days while you asked him to name a sea, and he let you, because that is the kind of man it takes to go down into the dark water and come back quiet. There is a particular silence that falls on a room of clever men when they understand, all at once, exactly how foolish they have been. It is not like other silences. I have heard a cathedral go quiet, and a parade ground, and the inside of my own helmet in the cold, and none of them is like the silence of 24 proud men discovering together that the joke was them. It went over the maritime hall like the tide had gone over the cellars, slow and total and impossible to push back. Marr was the first to find his voice, and to his credit, there was more credit in the man than I had thought. He did not bluster, and he did not slink. He walked across the wet carpet, his charted cape of iron and his close-cut beard and his weight that was no longer back on his heels, and he stood in front of the man he had offered a shilling to name a sea, and he was a long time finding the words, and when they came, they were the right ones. "I have read the Hollow Reach survey every year of my working life," Marr said. "I have taught from it. I have called the man who made it the finest sounder this coast ever produced, and I have stood in front of him for 2 days and called him a toy soldier who would drown in a bathtub." His voice was not steady. "There is no apology in the language that is large enough for that. I am not going to insult you by reaching for one. I am only going to say that I was wrong about everything I am proud of being right about, and you let me be wrong, and you went down those stairs anyway when not one of us who knew better would." He stopped. "Why did you let us? You could have ended it with one word." And Havard, soaked, the brass helmet at his feet, the white scar on the back of his hand catching the lantern light, gave the only answer I ever heard him give about any of it. A man who has been to the bottom of the dark water, he said slowly, doesn't need a room to know he's been there. I went out there to put marks on a chart so that other men wouldn't have to find the bottom the hard way, the way I found it. I lost 3 good men learning that water. I came up the last time and I couldn't carry it anymore, the carrying of it, so I set it down and I took a post where the only thing asked of me was to stand still and keep faith with the men around me, and that was rest to me. The standing still was rest. He looked around the silent hall. You can't shame a man with a thing he already knows about himself. You called me ignorant of the sea. I've been further into it than I ever wanted to go. I let you laugh because your laughing couldn't reach the place I'd been. And then the water came up the stairs, and the place I'd been was the only place that was any use to anybody, so I went and got it back out and used it. He picked up the helmet. That's all. I'd ask that none of it leaves this hall under my name. Crane's enough. The chart can keep Vandermeer. He carried the helmet back to old Cobb and gave it into his hands with a word of thanks for steady work on the pump. And he crossed the wet sea-green carpet to the foot of the Founder's chart. And he picked up his rifle from where he had set it against the frame of his own 19-year-old map. And he settled it on his shoulder. And he came back to attention beside me, eyes forward, and stood his watch. The exhibition closed early that night for the flooding, and the Marine men went out past us in 2s and 3s, and every one of them going out looked at the still red figure at the foot of the chart, and I watched the looking change. 3 days before they had looked at a thing. Now they looked at a man, and they did not quite know how to carry it, and several of them touched the brims of their hats to him going out, which a man does not do to a statue. The white-headed captain was the last to go. He stopped in front of Havard and did not offer his hand, because he was wise enough to see that Havard did not want the moment made into more than it was, and he only said, "Lo, I'll not name you, but the fellowship voted you our medal 12 years ago in absence for the Hollow Reach. It's been in a drawer waiting for a man who never came to claim it. May I at least take it out of the drawer? It can sit by the chart. No name on it but the one already there." Havard thought about it, eyes forward, and then he said, "By the chart. Not by me." So if you go to the Maritime Hall now, it is still there. The exhibition became a permanent thing. You will find the great Founder's chart of the Hollow Reach, the deepest true survey on the coast, and beside it in a small case a medal of the Fellowship of the Sounding, and a card that says only that the survey was made by a single hand, 19 years ago, in an open boat, in water that had killed every survey before it. There is no name on the card. The men of the Fellowship know whose it is. They have made it a quiet point of honor not to say. I stood beside Havard Crane for 4 more years before he was pensioned off, and in all that time I never once heard him name the sea, or the men he lost, or the dark water, or the medal in the case 8 feet from his post. And I never once forgot, after that night, that the stillest man in any room is the one most worth watching, because you do not know what he is being still about. He died old in a cottage above a small harbor, with the sea where he could hear it, and I went down for the burying, and I will tell you the last thing, which is the thing I most wanted to set down. There was a girl there at the graveside, grown now, perhaps 8 and 20, with her own little one by the hand. And I knew her, after a moment, the visitor, the one who had stopped admiring him in the Maritime Hall and then stood crying at the rail. She had come a long way to be there. She told me after that she had read about the Hollow Reach once she was old enough to read charts, and had worked out the rest, the way you can if you care to, and that she had never forgiven herself for the half a day she had looked at him the way the clever men told her to. "He never knew I felt it," she said. "I only met him the once and I got him wrong, and I spent my whole life sorry." He knew, I told her, because it was true and because she had carried it long enough. He saw everything. He saw you decide he was nothing, and he saw you decide you were wrong, and the second one is the only one he'd have remembered. He wasn't a man who counted up the times people got him wrong. He'd been to the bottom of the dark water. After that, what a roomful of people think of you on the surface, it just doesn't reach you. That was the whole of his piece. Nothing on the surface could reach him, because he'd been all the way to the bottom and come back, and a man who's done that is the one truly still thing in the world. She looked at the small stone. It says only his name, the one he took, and under it, because the fellowship asked and the family allowed, 4 words cut small. He charted the dark. And I stood there in the wind off his harbor, an old guardsman now myself, and I thought of the tall man rocking back on his heels under the glass roof, asking a statue to name a sea. And the statue who, when the water came up the stairs and the cleverest men in the building could not move, went down into the dark he had mapped with his own hands and brought the living back up into the light, and then came back, dripping, to stand his watch, and asked only that we keep his name out of it. You cannot tell from the surface how deep a man goes. That is the lesson the maritime hall taught me, and I have never let it go. The next time you find yourself in a room of loud, certain men, look for the still one at the edge of it, the one they have decided is furniture. Look at his hands. Watch how he carries the cold. And before you let the clever men tell you what he is, remember that the deepest water never shows on the surface, and neither ever does the deepest man.